paper, no one knows when it had been invented, or by who. What's certain is that it's as old as writing, obviously, as old as reading, as old as chalk, as ink, as the hand that learned to instrumentalize them as such. What was the first thing this hand wrote? Certainly it can't be about writing. Whatever it is, it had to have been cathartic, as all acts are. What's noteworthy here is that paper is a concept, and we only form concepts when the thing conceived has occurred frequently enough. In other words, paper has this meaning only as a thing to be widely used and mass-produced, as a commodity, if considered apart from the pecuniary circumstances involved in its acquisition and movement. If paper then is to be a commodity, so are the ideas which they quarry, and by extension, reading. Inevitably, this brings us to journalism, the industry whose operation fits the description we just gave. It's precisely here that the function for which paper was created was given its due, where it was finally absolved from catharsis, and, in keeping with our scheme, gained a new import. It's now become a means by which single ideas can be transmitted to as many people as there is paper to distribute. The manufacturing of paper was now considered only in tandem with the number of potential readers. It's for this reason, I believe, that Borges wrote, through his character, that the savage cannot perceive the missionary's Bible. To hand him a book and ask of him only to perceive the ideas imprinted on it, and disregard the very mechanism of his transmission, is ludicrous, as in the ideas themselves is imbibed as much of what they communicate as the history of the device by means of which they are communicated. How can he, the parochial savage, that is, imbibe those Bible passages which address humanity at large when the concept humanity is equally as foreign? When the material, the paper, which implied the collectivist idea of humanity, is unfamiliar to him. It would have sufficed for the missionary to have simply handed the savage a blank book or a piece of paper and left, as the material, the product itself, the paper, contains the idea of the civilization that produced it, in the same way that telecommunication implies knowledge of electricity, of electromagnetism, mastery of copper, silicon, and base metals, of calculus, geometry, and symbolic logic, of numbers. But the procedure by which to arrive at the idea from the accidental material, of induction, let's say, paradoxically demands that one be civilized enough, meaning that savage is a terminal condition. This tells us that the whole business of civilization was never this charitable act carried by the most endowed among us to the least, so much as an obligation which burdens and torments its agent, infinitely more so than its patient, to whom the lion's share of empathy is strangely directed. And so the plot goes, the way of peripeteia. If any man desires to be first, the same shall be the last of all and the servant of all. He who is least among you shall be the greatest. The encounter between the missionary and the savage is reenacted between the newspaper and their reader. Here a staggering wealth of timeless analogies is found. It's enough to consider the scale at which the press industry operates, its pervasiveness, its rigorosity. We find it jamming the stalls of every corner shop, coffee shop, bus and train station and airport around the world, from the lobbies of the fanciest hotels and districts in Vienna and Zurich, to the roughest, most squalid parts of Caracas, the favelas of Rio de Janeiro, of Calcutta. You'll find, in imposing font, the same headlines, the same world news being transmitted. All read the same sermon, in different voices, in different tongues and accents, but nonetheless, all who read, read. We find narratives that have been professionally cropped and rearranged in such a way as to fit the mind that's reading it. The savage archetype is once more projected onto the potential reader, Catholicizing no less they are, so self-important as to demand of us the same credulity, the same acquiescence as the missionary would have expected from his supposed intellectual inferior. The context underlying much of the news appear on the page. The words are always seemingly on the page. The structure is well put together, the style and words familiar. All it asks of us is our unrelenting belief. They appear to affirm what we know to be true more than they inform us as to what we don't, as the name would suggest. Thus, we don't read the news so much as corroborate them. where the savage's unfamiliarity with the artifice which the missionary seeks to entice him with is the greatest advantage he could have asked for in such a situation, the newsreader's absorption in the culture in which commodity and ideology are inseparable, is his chief disadvantage. He's having to invoke a sort of Humean skepticism, a Cartesian meditation, a learned ignorance to be able to free himself from the grip of the seemingly self-evident. But what's the proper object of those papers? To what purpose do they owe their existence? Everything, every event reported by them, however spontaneous, however everyday lifelike they strike us as, however remote, however approximate, however true, are not so much random events as events that take place under the ideological context which we collectively accept and thus inhabit. Hence the term newsworthy. All is expertly woven into a history that it's clearly contriving. The method followed by the journalist is no different from that of the historian, if we're to define both as reporters. Both rest on an understanding of belief, which perfect definition is relayed by David Hume and Giambattista Vico, that it's the vivacity of ideas, hence why eloquence is seen, often indifferently, as a virtue, and so under the edifying mask of total transparency, the Hippocratic oath of the journalist, they work to elicit credulity at a scale hitherto unattained, to lift from our shoulders the onus of skepticism, of intellectual exercise, and thus think on our behalf. Now every piece of news has an omniscient narrator. There are no mysteries unless answers were judged to be counterproductive. No mysteries, no secrets. The theogonic figure Aletheia is conjured, perhaps nowhere else as ceremoniously, as religiously as in the modern press. To be inscrutable, mysterious, or inexplicable was to stimulate curiosity, critique, suspicion, and speculation. But how can that be done if the newspaper's content leaves no room for the above? A discerning enough vision would see in a person's act of sitting with the sheets of a newspaper spread wide over their lap, and under the swindling spell of their content, the reenactment of Socrates' execution. Both, after all, the true Socrates as well as the potential Socrates, the reader, are to die by ingesting a poisonous leaf. And both more so by way of choice. But with the omniscience and omnipresence of those leaves, it seems that turning one's eyes away from them as though from the petrifying allure of Medusa is impossible, perhaps unreasonable, should one not have thought that far into it. As these same leaves seem to justify literacy itself, and paper, to be the very object for whose sake one had to learn to read and write, to be acquainted, and what's to be acquainted with but one's own social and political milieu, that is, oneself at the time. And there connects the tail with the mouth. There, where ironies are most solid. Credulity, it's said, is a tendency to be too ready to believe that something is real or not. But what are the criteria of reality and fiction? And what's exactly meant by fiction and reality? Isn't what we understand by fiction also didactic, offensive, enlightening? Perhaps fiction is more real than reality is. The so-called real is burdened by the question of its reality, the very standard to which it holds itself. Authenticity. We question whether an event really happened. Paradoxically, the pretense to reality seems to invoke the opposite notion, whereas fiction is freed from that. Denial, a condition associated with the so-called real, is something from which the decidedly fictitious does not suffer. We're primitive and uncritical as regards the confessedly real. We confront it binarily, wavering between outright rejection and unconditional acceptance. This is not the case with fiction. The intellectual energies which would have been wasted debating over the reality of a particular event is directed elsewhere, towards the meaning, the symbolism, the creative substance, etc. Fiction is free from the decisive nature of the real. It's from the standpoint that the newspaper business may be approached. Real is whatever the majority corroborates, whatever the community at large subscribes to. If measured by the standard of utility and influence, then the fictitious and the real are the same. In fiction, we see something else in an event. We think, what does this particular event mean? Here we show that we've transcended the ironically opaque state of reality. Don't we understand fiction, after all, by analogy to the real, as such contaminating it? This shows that the real is nothing but a standard of judgment, a reference, reciprocally proving that fiction can serve also as a standard. Isn't this the very function that the Homeric epics served? Does it matter at this point that Raskolnikov isn't real? The point is, our intellectual approach to the fictitious is, ironically, the more genuine, because the intellect perceives in fiction the underlying forms which, in reality, would have appeared blindingly authoritative. Interestingly, no state can be absolute. The real is tried with deception, and fiction is credited reality of the highest order. The two pull, quite violently I may add, upon one another. The fabric of the universe as weaved by God abhors a vacuum.